religions by asking us to challenge our own assumptions rather than study concrete isms. She distinguished between comprehension and understanding, where comprehension implies grasping knowledge, understanding as standing under what one does not know, where uncertainty is our teacher. In comparative religious ethics, we were discussing religious traditions and their respective perceptions of how to act ethically, how to live with and for others. The profound question that stays with me still formed out of that discussion. Is it possible to act ethically from within a position of uncertainty? What would it mean to not know, to base one's worldview on continually attempting to undo assumptions rather than solidifying them? In the context of teaching English 101, acting from a place of uncertainty comes into play through reading and listening, where reading, student writing, and listening with openness comprises a kind of ethics. When a teacher reads students' work, imagining the ideas behind it, by engaging in the text with an imaginative capacity, a meaningful dialogue between writer and reader develops. The risk of reading unethically, with a mind holding steadfast to assumptions and harboring model answers too tightly to hear what the author's voice offers, is that it closes off learning for both student and teacher. It is this sense of openness that I most carry with me into the 101 classroom and all the work that goes behind it. Various aspects of my history help inform the kind of openness I'm referring to, namely studying Buddhism and previous customer service jobs. In Buddhist philosophy, we perceive particular pieces of reality as unchanging, and language, the naming of things, contributes to the illusion of solidity, when actually everything is continually in flux. Accordingly, things are not built upon certainty, but rather openness. It is this kind of openness, where knowledge is created through conversation, rather than held by one and given to another, that I'm interested in bringing to the English 101 composition classroom. In Buddhism, a self only comes into being through relationship, and those relationships are constantly changing. Within this interconnectedness, separating self and other is illusory. They are interdependent for existence. Of course, we do see teacher and student as distinct in a composition course, but throughout this paper I hope to show the ways in which interconnectedness can inform teaching. I will draw upon theorists whose views resonate with the Buddhist philosophy, as well as my own experience, to discuss specifically how the notion of interconnectedness relates to forming a mutual dialogue between students and teacher that invites students to become active participants in their own learning, rather than passive receptors of knowledge. It is important to note that interconnectedness does not mean an erasure or denial of positions. A teacher does come to the conversation with more experience, more communities inherent in her individual voice, and she should converse honestly from that place. But so should students converse from their respective places. No matter what the level of experience, there is still something valuable to learn through dialogue in the resulting in-between space. And furthermore, those differing levels contribute to the conversation rather than diminish it. Wendy Bishop's conference paper, titled Against the Odds in Composition and Rhetoric, points to the relationship between genuine conversation and community when she draws upon Joe Harris's definition of community as, quote, a social space where people have reason to come into contact with each other because they have claims and interests that extend beyond the borders of their own safe houses, neighborhoods, disciplines, or communities, end of quote. What would happen to the composition classroom conversation if we imagined we had something to learn about English from non-native speakers, as opposed to only standardizing their dialect? What might happen if we viewed each individual as immersed in a different form of language, from a different community of influences, and saw those differences as having something to uniquely contribute to composing a conversation? Many theorists, in discussing the relationship between language and knowledge, conclude that knowledge exists within collaborative agreement, not something independent of or unchanged by the participants. Kenneth Bruffray conceives of knowledge as something that comes out of community, where learning is not individual but social. He writes, quote, knowledge is the product of human beings in a state of continual negotiation or conversation, end quote. Here, while a composition teacher has previously participated in other communities of knowing, and thus holds more experience in dialogue, knowledge is not something she can claim to give to students. Knowledge is instead created through mutual conversation. Michael Carter acknowledges this as well as he writes about how doing within a particular discipline relates to knowing. Quote, knowledge is local and dynamic rather than universal and incremental, and that reality is changed by the inquirer rather than independent of the inquirer, end quote. In this way, students entering the academic communal discourse of a composition classroom are already participants in that knowledge. They are already changing it. Knowledge is not something separate from them. Furthermore, knowledge continually changes depending on what the community of participants agrees upon for the time being. So knowing will continually shift with each classroom dynamic. If knowledge changes in this way and is not something static to give and receive, it can only be revealed through dialogue with respective present participants, where each contributor is part knower. Robert Yagelski draws upon a Buddhist story to illustrate how we are immersed in knowledge. After Buddha becomes enlightened, he is reluctant to teach, as everyone already inherently has Buddha nature, the potential for enlightenment. People are already in water, Buddha cannot lead them to it. However, they don't realize that and they are dying of thirst, so he must teach by showing them they're already in water. Faithful to the Zen tradition Yagelski invokes, here a teacher's role is to help reveal what a student already knows by conversing rather than stacking on new layers of knowledge. Bruce Horner writes specifically about negotiation as key to a dialogic process of learning. He challenges readers to conceive of errors as social achievements, evidence that something valuable is happening in the learning process. Yet this crucially infers, quote, "If errors are social achievements, then they can't fully exist until both reader and writer agree on their existence," end quote. The importance of active listening, openness, as critical to mutual dialogue comes into play when he writes, quote, "Negotiation is not a matter of one party persuading a second to adopt the position of the first, nor a process of exchange, barter between two parties, but a process of joint change and learning in which power operates dialectically," end quote. In other words, there's a grappling with something unknown between teacher, reader, and student-writer in an attempt to arrive at an agreed-upon truth for the matter at hand, giving both parties power. Horner goes even farther to suggest that teachers who do not see or otherwise reject their students' power indirectly discard their own as well. This illustrates how power exists in the act of conversing, divided between individuals, not wholly with either. While it is argued that because teachers grade students, power can never be honestly distributed to students, I want to challenge that by calling upon the fluidity of identity and context. Donna LaCourte argues for performative identity in the composition classroom, an identity created and recreated by each specific rhetorical situation. She deems this the textual I, and contrasts it with a stationary view of self. Buddhism, too, posits that the self changes. It is not a block of ice moving isolated through the world, but rather water, shifting form, shape, and texture within each context. If identity is fluid and based upon the rhetorical situation of the moment, then it is, in fact, not the same teacher that engages in dialogue that also does the grading. In a portfolio-based class, such as that where I teach at West Virginia University, the context for being receptive to students writing as a reader rather than an assessor takes place throughout most of the course. The time to offer grades provides a different context. It is entirely possible to create mutual dialogue with students throughout the course and grade them at the end, as long as that is clear through a discussion about differing contexts from the beginning. I comment on students' writing always in an attempt to engage them in dialogue from the place they come to the assignment from. I read their text as openly as I ask them to read others. I try to imagine the thinking processes behind their sentences and ideas, and I try to ask in the margins rather than assume. I think of openness as an ethical way to read, which becomes even more important to bear in mind when one is fatigued. Of course, as a teacher, I must balance bringing suggestions to the draft and reading with a mind ready to undo its own assumptions in order to actually hear what the writer is offering. This is complicated, but the beauty in reading is the engagement between readers and writers' imaginations, and it is that conversation in particular with English 101 that I find the most spacious for learning. It has taken me a while to understand that one thing I offer students is reading and listening with a deep imaginative capacity. In attempting to engage with the imagination behind their writing, I hope to draw out more sentences with active thinking behind them, more thoughts put into words, further relationship between the student and his or her interaction with language. In practice, my teaching derives from a deep-seated belief in openness and conversation, but on the surface, my techniques are subtle. For instance, when I ask students to read and write a response to a controversial article about a Muslim woman protesting a law in France that doesn't allow her to wear her headscarf, I asked, What is her argument? What thoughts does it bring up in you regarding Islam, Western society, women, etc.? Did you learn anything? What is your opinion of her argument and why? I emphasize wanting to know what they genuinely thought. I placed importance in authenticity, in the act of thinking, rather than the specific content of their thoughts. I responded to their writing with comments such as, "It seems you really read this text with an open mind, and it illumined things for you because of that." I hoped by articulating what kind of reader they'd been, it would show how putting oneself in an open-minded conversation with a text can illuminate things otherwise unseen. The notion of revision is a key factor of my conversations with students. When I comment on a final for now draft, I explain this to students, and I invite them to see a lot of feedback as something good, visual evidence of engagement as a reader, rather than merely intimidating ink suggesting what's wrong. Students do ask me questions after class and are comfortable sharing their opinions with me in conferences, so I think my comments get across that I want to be in conversation with their ideas, not only assessing in a disembodied, uninvolved way. I ask them questions of their text and note the places I feel something is really coming together well and explain why, asking them if they might expand further in such ways throughout other places in the paper. I encourage students verbally and in writing on their papers to talk with me about the feedback, to ask questions, to ask me to clarify, or tell me if they disagree. I also try to explain the meaning behind everything I ask students to do, even when some might assume it's rudimentary. For instance, a student was handing in homework assignments with 1 or 2 word answers, and I responded, "It's helpful to write complete sentences in order to develop your thoughts to their full potential, instead of merely, you need to write complete sentences." I try not to leave anything as an arbitrary rule, even citation issues, page length, etc., only in existence due to some authority figure, but I show them the thinking behind it. This keeps me learning as well, tracing thought processes behind things, making connections, making readings relevant to class discussion, and inviting students to air their concerns or discontents, not merely to vent, but to take them into consideration. I often ask them to reflect on whether or not certain examples were useful, with a why or why not, and through their midterm feedback, we changed some elements of peer review to try to make it more productive. Reading with openness extends from student text to the language of the classroom. When I worked at Half Price Books, a coffee shop, or a vegetable stand in the summer, I enjoyed emptying my own thoughts to make room for another's life, briefly intersecting my own. I loved conversing while hunting for a particular book, rolling muskmelons between my hands to pick out the most ripe, or pouring someone a cup of coffee at 6 in the morning. It felt special to notice someone's life for a moment, a tiny glimpse of someone's whole. These customer service jobs reminded me that everyone has a story, and that what rises to the surface is only a slight indication of the ocean beneath. In class, if a student rolls her eyes or sighs reluctantly, it can feel draining at first. Negative energy weighs a lot and infringes upon the openness I try to walk into the room with. However, I'm reminded that there's an unseen story underneath what bubbles up, and I try to sense part of that from such surface cues. The fact that I teach a required introductory course has the potential to complicate authenticity, but it challenges me to become more innovative with lesson plans and challenges students to take responsibility for part of their own learning. I tell students from the very beginning of the course that if they're open to learning something, they will absolutely, even if it's not entirely what they or I expect. I tell them that learning requires openness. One specific lesson plan I created in order to help students become more actively involved in their own learning asked students to work collaboratively in small groups to reflect on how skills learned in English 101 connects to other courses and/or their life outside the classroom. Each group created a visual, tying in with analyzing visual rhetoric to illustrate those connections and where they overlap. I posed several questions on the assignment prompt handout in such a way that the answers wouldn't be readily available, but that required active reflection to pull these connections to the surface and create new ones. What conversations or courses outside of 101 have influenced your writing process or vice versa? What have you learned so far that you'll want to remember at the end of the semester? I told students that the project was a process of discovery, the act of reflecting, rather than a report on something already fully comprehended. I related this process of finding connections to that of forming a thesis statement, putting perspectives in conversation with each other, first listening, then including one's own voice. Robert Yagelski looks to Zen Buddhism to articulate the ambivalence of inherently having authority as a teacher, but at the same time wanting to undercut it so that, quote, it does not inhibit the effort to foster critical consciousness in students, end quote. I want my authority to bespeak the kind of openness I ask students to participate in assignments and class activities with. Each student comes from a different story and a different level of knowledge regarding the subject matter, and therefore has a unique and indispensable perspective to offer and others to learn from. At the very beginning of my teaching, I struggled with contradictions, empowering students versus being an authority figure, valuing students' authenticity versus one-on-one being a required class, reading openly versus correcting student papers, etc. I've come to realize most of these factors do not constitute solid, mutually exclusive dichotomies, and rather exist as elements in need of balance. My teaching self is not my whole self. My identity, along with students' identities, are constantly changing in relation to each other in the course's shifting contexts. I want to give students what I've got in terms of knowledge, but I ask them to bring their own to the table as well. And as stated, part of what I've got to give is an interest and ability to read closely and imaginatively. Teaching requires openness, as does learning. In this way, we create knowledge dialectically with shared power.